Hello, Duncan.
Hi, Steve. Yeah, so thanks for emailing Paul. We'll just see if he manages to leave the demonstration to join us.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that'll be fine. Even if there's a bit of traffic, he'll be here.
Yeah.
I'll make you co-host if that's all right. I'll tell
you
you for
can,
why.
Right. Yeah.
Is that my email, what am I talking about? My Wi-Fi collapsed yesterday afternoon.
Oh, I see. So just in case it goes.
First time it's happened for ages, but just to be on the safe side, so that it will automatically transfer to you if I lose it for a second.
Okay,
so, yeah. And it also means that if anyone calls it trouble, you can silence them without having to say goodnight. You can just mute people if you like, because once I've...
Yeah.
There you go.
All right. How many have we got registered? Because it was about 30 when we last spoke, but that was
63.
63. Good. That's a bit better.
Yeah. So that's that. I've sent, by the way, I've sent you your the PDF of the...
Yes, I've just noticed that. I've been away for a couple of days, so I've just been going through.
Well, I'm going away. I'm going away next week, so...
okay, so I see you sent it to David as well, so...
Yeah.
No, I'll go through and check it over the weekend. That's fine. Thanks for doing that.
No problem.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to try and focus this discussion on the book. We'll just have to see how it goes.
Well, yeah. But I mean, that's fair, because that's what people
are signing up for. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you wanted to do it on something else, then
could have done it.
Yeah, well, then at least then we could have made a decision.
Welcome to those that have joined us. We're just waiting for other people to join up, obviously, because it's only about 1:45.
Yeah. It's also running live on YouTube.
Yes, I gather that. So is that already on? That's already on YouTube now, is it?
Should be
running. Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to check, but it was earlier. I set it up anyway.
No, that's fine. Your yellow light on your third shelf looks like a hands up, by the way. It's the same color as the Zoom hands up. It threw me for a minute.
It caused confusion, couldn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Where are we? Yes, it was working. Good. It's about a minute and a half behindhand.
Okay.
So as I just checked, it just started talking about my yellow light yet again.
Yes. No. It's not visible on the screen. That's just to confuse me.
Oh, Michael.
Hello, good day, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, guys.
Hello, Michael. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm sure like you all are a bit of shock over the events in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I didn't expect things to evolve that far.
Nobody did.
Yeah.
Oh, hello, Paul.
Okay, I'll turn my camera off just for streaming purposes to help with my streaming.
Good.
Paul, hello, welcome.
Nice to see you all. Well,
Well,
you.
yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
thanks very much for joining us, given what else is happening. And I see you've been
Yeah.
busy on a demonstration, at least one demonstration today.
just one.
There's one. Okay.
Oh, well, so thanks for rushing back. Duncan here will be chairing it. I'm kind of the host, as it were, but I shall therefore.
Yep.
It's probably the last you'll hear of me now.
Good. Well, listen, Steve,
Unless I have a
to...
comment about what you say, of course.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear it. But we have a load of mutual friends, and your name used to be said to me a lot, like sort of 30 years ago. But I never met you.
No.
Let me just see. My partner's here. You knew Steve Cushion, didn't you?
Yes.
Come here.
He's on screen.
There you are. Go down.
Oh.
Jane
Oh,
Bruce.
hello. Hello. Yeah.
He says hello.
Oh, hello.
Yes, I saw Steve McSweeney and Dave Stocking the other day.
Did you?
First time in quite some time. So these are presumably part of the names that we recall.
Yeah. Dave Hughes was a big friend of mine, and Jane is my partner and was in Workers' Power.
God, Hughes, yes. Yeah, God, that's 30 years ago as well, isn't it, since he passed away?
It is, yeah, 92.
Yeah.
Paul, you may or may not remember, you interviewed me on housing policy about 3 or 4 years ago. And
I do remember.
You do remember. And you didn't use the piece because I was apparently too critical of City Hall. Anyway, good to see you again.
I was probably Channel 4 cutting my time.
Yeah. No, Marilyn. Right, Paul, how long do you want to speak for? I mean, it's entirely up to you.
I was thinking not longer than 20 minutes, really, because I think it would be better to hear people's responses and have a discussion rather than anything else. I've not done. I'll do it off the cuff sort of thing, and just let's do 20 minutes. And
okay, that's fine, and that gives lots of time for discussion. And as I say, we'll try and keep it, as I think we kind of asked you, to the historical section of the book, though we understand some of the broader points. I have read the book myself, so at least I have an advantage. Hello, David.
Glad to see you've got him.
Yep. We thought you'd be doing this from Downing Street, which would have been
I nearly did. I was thinking about doing that.
Yeah, but that would have been difficult to keep the noise level of others down.
Are you in your quiet cafe, Paul, or are you at home?
I'm actually at home because I was on Downing Street on Whitehall, and then I realised I could actually get home in time.
Yeah, Laura said it wasn't too far.
Where are you, David? Hello. Sorry, there you are. Yeah, I couldn't see you then. Nice to meet you in person.
Yes, absolutely. I must try and do it sometime. So did you go to the rally?
Yeah. It was much bigger than the ones in the weekday. And what was interesting is that normally at these rallies, it's the Ukrainian community, which now I mean, the Cold War, all these communities were like, it was cloak and dagger, wasn't it? But now the Ukrainian community in London is just working class people. It's really working class. If you wanted to say, where is the London working class? Like, that was it. But swelled by lots of very well-meaning middle-class people who were not the usual types who come on things. We've had 2 Labour MPs down there. Clive Lewis is down there now, and one from Wales for Pontypool called Alex Griffiths-Jones. So, we did have what was interesting, it was just like Ukrainians, religious people, so, the Orthodox Church, and then this tight, weird coterie of Labour people. Which is unusual, I mean, I know that the Tories were mingling yesterday. Ben Webster, the defence minister, went on it and had a look. Anyway.
So when did you get back from Lviv?
Wednesday morning.
Yeah.
And then it kicked off overnight, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah, because I think Julie Ward, who you may know, who was an MEP.
She was on the same thing.
The same. Yeah.
We just had to rush to the airport with a wad of hryvnia and get on the first plane we could find.
Yeah, because Julie's written an article for Chartist magazine, which is on the web. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Right, we're just waiting for more people to join us. We've got over 60 registered, but inevitably not all of them.
No, you're not gonna. It's also people often in these, they join on the dot of the time they're meant to join. So when it says live streaming, is it live streaming somewhere else, or is it just it's just to the people who've logged in? Yeah.
Steve, do you want to explain? It's live on.
It's live on YouTube, isn't
it? But
is it? All right.
Yeah. So that's for anybody who's.
Has anybody got a link? Anybody got a link they could send me on that? Because I could tweet it.
Can you do that, Steve?
Sorry, I went to make myself a cup of tea. What was the request?
Can you send Paul the YouTube link so he can tweet it?
Yep.
Yeah, I would have expected more, but we've clashed with 2 rugby matches and Liverpool.
Absolutely. It's interesting what people prioritise, yeah.
I didn't realise when we agreed this one.
There will always be football. There will always be demonstrations.
Hey, Liverpool's my team.
You've also clashed with SOS NHS.
Oh, yes, that's on as well, isn't it?
Oh, really? Just too much.
Paul, I have emailed you the link.
Okay.
Which, to the best of my knowledge, is running. I'll check it again.
Oh, Terry Brotherston. Right.
Yeah, we'll wait another 10 minutes or so while people sign on, but do say hello to each other while we're waiting if you want to. Yeah, we'll wait another 10 minutes or so while people sign on, but do say hello to each other while we're waiting if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah, we're on.
All right.
But
I come and join you for a bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, we're on. But
Okay, it's 2 o'clock now, but we'll wait another 5 minutes or so while people log on.
Take this opportunity to quickly ask Paul. Paul, back in 2011, I think at the end of July, you were interviewing someone in United States. I think it was Obama having trouble with regards to his passing his budget or something like that. And I think you were interviewing somebody from Google who was
2 o'clock now, but we'll wait another 5 minutes or so.
A multi-billionaire from Google who was speaking about the neoliberals' policies, about the American state. He's worried about the American state having to support too many unproductive people. Remember that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know where I can get a clip of that from?
Wow. 2011.
Yeah.
I'd have to try and I don't keep records of things I did, so I'd have to try and. I mean, it was 2011, yeah.
I think it was the end of July 2011 when Obama was having trouble getting his budget through. I teach sociology at Ulster University. So
all right.
I always wanted to know if, I'm sorry I didn't tape it at the time, but where I could get such a clip from.
Was this the Fiscal Cliff? Did we call it the Fiscal Cliff?
I might be. I've been trying to search for it.
Let me have a think. I don't have the BBC archive access to the BBC archive anymore, but I will have. I'll have a way.
Were you in BBC at the time or Channel 4?
BBC.
Right. Okay.
Can I make a suggestion that if Paul doesn't mind, I'll give your email to Michael.
Yeah. Do it. Absolutely.
Who I can vouch for.
Yeah.
He's
Thanks
a decent chap. And then you can maybe sort that out privately. Shall we get going, Duncan?
Yeah,
have we got many people in the waiting room, Steve, or none?
I haven't got a waiting room. They're all in.
They're all in. Okay. Well, I suggest we start, and a few people may join us. Obviously, it's quite a busy day in terms of demonstrations and other events today. But thank you very much to Paul for joining us, given he's been very involved in the Ukraine demonstrations both today and earlier in the week, and was in Ukraine a few days ago. For those that don't know me, I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Socialist History Society. So welcome to this talk. We've been doing quite a lot of talks. The advantage of Zoom is you don't all have to sit in a basement of a room, and we can get people from all over the world participating. So many of you will be familiar with Paul's work as an economist, a journalist, and writer. His fairly recent book, Clear Bright Future, as he says in his new book, maybe he's less optimistic than he was when he wrote that book. So Paul on how to stop fascism, history, ideology, and resistance. Paul's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. And if he wants to go on longer, I won't cut him off, but then there'll be lots of time for discussion. If, as usual, you can all keep mute while Paul is speaking. And then once Paul is finished, if you can then either do the hands up under the reactions on Zoom, or if you can't do that technically, wave at me and I'll try and bring you in to the discussion. So thanks, Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's great to see so many people, so many names I know as well. And respect. So can you hear me?
Yes.
You all hear? Good. Yeah. So before talking about fascism, I just want to talk a little bit about being in the middle of history, because as a journalist, we famously tell ourselves that all we are doing is writing history in the first draft, and I've become more and more aware of sort of how difficult that is in a time of information warfare, and at a time where we're in the middle of this Ukraine war. I would imagine prior to this war, I mean, this is the first conventional war between peers ever since 1945. We would have been, the historians would have gone, sort of regimental history. They would have gone interviews, with participants, oral history with soldiers. You could walk the battlefield. That's quite a thing to do now. But as we're seeing from Ukraine now, I mean, in complete breach of the Geneva Conventions, people are taking videos this morning of Russian soldiers who've been captured, and they're interviewing them on camera, on their phone, and having arguments with them. I mean, we have got, in other words, this incredible richness now of evidence and primary source material. But for us as journalists, it becomes harder and harder to sort through it. And what I often say to my fellow journalists, we're a socialist society here, so let's use the right word for these people. Most bourgeois journalists in the bourgeois media actually only get through their everyday lives by believing that they have no theory of the world, that they have no axe to grind, no angle to take, and that they simply absorb the information. That is the ideology that they believe. Obviously, as a Marxist, I don't do that. And I've often said to them, look, as I go, I structure the world around preconceptions, around structures that I know exist, like class, like gender, like nationality. I think in general in my career, I think that's produced better journalism, but it also obviously carries the risk of producing bad history. And that's been the dilemma of the work I've done in the books that I've written, because the books have been not the first draft of history, but the second draft of history. That is pretty close to the experience, often told in the first person, often just making do what I can with the sources available. Going to Kenya, interviewing people who work in sweatshops, going to Bolivia, going down a mine, finding things out. The famous Trotsky quote was Lenin, isn't it, originally? The truth is always concrete. To me, is almost a kind of mantra. Only when you see, the little details of places and events can you really understand them. I always remember just calling to mind memories of my work, arriving in Huanuni in Bolivia, during the rise of Evo Morales. Evo Morales had just become president, but was not secure, and there was a mass movement of miners, fighting each other, fighting the state, throwing, dynamite sticks into the road in front of our car. And the most telling detail I can remember from that entire trip was meeting this leftist who said, yes, we've got everything set out for you. You can go and visit the miners' HQ, the miners' health service. We've even got a choir. And he said, but they only sing sad songs. And that, to me, that detail was the thing you, as a journalist, you write, you have to write it, you have to grab it while it's there. So thinking about the work I've done for this book, and for other books where it's been primarily of a historical relevance, like my first book, Live Working or Die Fighting. What I decided to do was go as far as possible to the first person sources. So to always imagine myself, I mean, you have to research the classic historical works on the period you're you're trying to write about. But then I do that. I get a kind of structure of what happened according to the historians, and then I make my own mind up about what is a class analysis of it, what is a materialist, and we'll come to materialism in a minute. What is a materialist analysis of that event? And then I kind of test it out and see whether or not there is evidence for it in, as much as possible, the oral histories, the first person histories. So, for example, in this book, Yves Rosenhaft's Beating the Fascists was invaluable. There was another micro study. I've not got all my references up in front of me, but I can get them up if you need them. There was a micro study of a Sturmabteilung cell, which turned out to be the one that is featured in the BBC documentary, the one that was on trial, Sturm 33, Sturm 33. And Rosenhaft, sorry, not Rosenhaft, this micro study by a German historian. What was brilliant is that they got their police interviews. And once you're down into verbatim reports of police interviews, of course, the police change interviews, as we know. But what was really interesting there was always the kind of, and if you've ever been arrested, when you're interviewed, you don't tell the truth. But it was the small comments there as well, both by, I think the study is of communists and fascists who'd been arrested for political violence, and always the same that my friend brought me, I'm unemployed. You could see immediately this generalization we make about fascism, or rather about the militarized fascism and about the KPD, the German Communist Party, that they drew from the same set of people, turns out to be very well substantiated in not just by the demographics of who was arrested, what they said, but also, the language they used, the everyday world. So I'm starting with these at this detail level to explain what I do and what I've done. I've been asked to only talk about the historical part of this book, and I will. But so let me just say about why have I written it? What am I trying to do? I think up to about the mid-90s and maybe beyond, professional historians were justifiably trying to slice and dice the problem. Why did fascism happen? What was it? What was the actual phenomenon? Who joined, whether in Italy or Germany or Action Française, who joined, what did they do? Those who study the movement phase. I'm not going to talk very much at all about the state phase of fascism when you're in power, for reasons I'll come to. But I think with the rise of the populist right, historians then got dragged into a kind of sociological ideal type debate about who's a conservative, who's a populist, and who's a fascist. Quite rightly, because you only want to hit the fascists basically and argue with the populists and kind of outvote the conservatives. But for me, the question which confronts us is not why did it happen once, but why is it happening again? And as I say in the book, obviously there is an order of magnitude difference in those two questions, because why is it happening again begs the question, will it go on happening forever? Which is not the question I think the historians of the immediate post-war period could even imagine. So Roger Griffin gives this sort of short history of the history of fascism, and he describes the immediate post-war period as liberal confusion. Sort of if you were a psychiatrist, you looked for causes in Hitler's psychiatry. If you were an economist, you looked for causes in mass unemployment. If you were, either a Germanophobe or a Germanophile, you looked for causes in the German character. And it was only really you get the emergence with Nolte and one or two other books of comparative fascist studies, where you get the beginnings of a discussion of what became the discussion of generic fascism. Now, the only reason they could begin that, and certainly in Ernst Nolte's case, in Fascism in its Era, Three Phases of Fascism in English. Nolte starts, we can study this because it's dead. No further variants are possible. It is a finished episode, therefore ideal for the historian. We'll dig out the records, we'll interview the people. It's all a bit less emotive. Therefore, I can now begin work. And I would imagine that sounded really plausible. That sounded better than the period of liberal confusion where everyone was projecting things onto facts. Then in the 70s, we get the arrival of historical sociology and the attempt to start from ideal type definitions. And so it's interesting, they produce these huge definitions. And I would argue that that was the beginning of really the detailed work on fascism. I think, I can't remember if it was Nolte or what one of them says. It's a great thing. Take the fascists at their word. Listen to what they say. Because so much of the left tradition and the liberal tradition had said, well, what they say is just a jumble of nonsense. You know, why would you be interested in it? It's just a hodgepodge and a montage of other people's ideas. That even was the view in political science as well. Remember Brzezinski, the whole, I'm not even interested in their ideas. I'm only interested in the structure of totalitarian states. So it was a move forward to take their ideas seriously. And I think some of the greatest depth historical writing about fascism has been done, you know, Tim Mason, Robert Paxton, and the rest. We could go through them, Zeev Sternhell. But then we get to this kind of post-structuralist moment where Griffin and co. basically decide that we're not studying fascism at the moment at all. We're studying the idea of fascism. We study it from the inside out. We craft the most perfect diamond pure two-line definition of it, and then you know, study the expression rather than the thing. And for those of us who are Marxists, that is almost a pure idealistic take on history. But nevertheless, it went on producing really good historical explorations of fascism. The problem I have, you know, as a historian in the first draft, is that when I came to start asking the question, why is it happening again? I didn't find a lot of that very useful. And indeed, almost the thing that triggered me to write this was activists in America in the anti-fascist movement. They're often young graduates. They've often got an academic background. They're on the streets doing the business and very brave, but they've got no theory. And as I write in the book, the theoretical debates inside German social democracy about what fascism was and its relationship, and what Nazism was and its relationship to the middle class and to economic crisis, the greatest contributions took place in trade union theoretical journals. The trade union theoretical journal Die Arbeit was where the famous article Panik im Mittelstand was written, whereby the argument was the middle class had panicked, but it would split into two, and it would one part would gravitate to the proletariat, the other to the bourgeoisie, and therefore fascism had no independent social base, and this was a bubble waiting to burst. You know, wrong as though that was, it would have been discussed in trade union branches by trade union officials in the DGB, and learned from and interacted with. So now you talk to young activists, all they have, it's weird, all they have is what their professors say. And as you know, in academia, you pay your money and you take your choice. You can have post-structuralism, structuralism, you know, anti-genericism, you know, so they're totally confused, and they're sitting there literally making lists of definitions of fascism. All of them are different, and none of them are helping. So what I wanted to try and do was to say, okay, well, let's try and construct a materialist theory of fascism. And as I did it, I found that the materials to do it were pretty desultory. Why? Because, first of all, in case you haven't noticed, Stalinism hasn't died. the phenomenon of the Soviet Union has died, but the way of thinking of Stalinism is very much alive. And I attribute this to not to the survival of old communist parties, which they aren't, a few old communist parties are survived, but the way of thinking, the anti-humanist, structuralist, objectivist, determinist way of thinking is alive and well among a lot of radical people who basically get this education in Foucault and the rest. If you can believe that history is a process without a subject, as Althusser taught us, you can also believe, and that Foucault's words, human beings are social constructs, then that very much sort of non-subjectivist, non-agency-based view of the world sits very nicely among a lot of young activists. So that's one reason why they have a paucity of theory. The other reason is we don't have like trade union activist theoretical journals that can discuss these things. And so what happens is that the people involved in the movements end up deferring to academia rather than absorbing experience and then trying to infuse the theory with the experience. And so, you know, what are we left with? You will still go to meetings on the left, especially in America, where people are using Georgy Dimitrov's 1935 definition of fascism as the official explanation, so that it is the armed wing of the most reactionary section of the bourgeoisie, the financial bourgeoisie. And then they look in their newspaper and they see that Goldman Sachs has given several $1 million to a left-wing Black Lives Matter organizing center in New York. And it just doesn't work with it. Why? Hold on a minute, financial bourgeoisie. Then a lot of them are struggling along with these post-structuralist definitions. The whole fascism is hyper violent, hyper nationalism of rebirth. The problem is it's quite internationalist, and a lot of the most virulent forms of fascism have moved way beyond ultranationalism, palingenic ultranationalism, as Griffin calls it. So the activists are kind of flying blind. I wanted to do three things in trying to remedy that. I think we have to study the movement phase, as Gramsci did, as a process. And I think there's a direct line between Gramsci's insights in a 1921 article called Elemental Forces, where Gramsci, as an orthodox Marxist, trained in the kind of Labriola, Second International school, says fascism is a phenomenon which can only in part be explained by class forces. That for me is the really interesting thing. It's a process. It's an unfolding historical process that is what he would have written had he got the vocabulary he could have written, which is quite autonomous from, maybe wholly autonomous from some of the historical forces that we understand. The second thing is to try and ask, what is its relation to capitalism and capitalist crisis and the trajectory of capitalism, rather than what's its relationship to the economy and to economic interests within capitalism. I think that was the big problem that the Comintern had. It could never accept, it was always trying to look at fascism as a pure reflection of sections of the bourgeoisie, almost never understanding that it had its own momentum. And the fact that the middle class, far from panicking and splitting, panicked and solidified around fascism was a thing they couldn't understand in class terms. And so in terms of then thinking about why is it happening again, obviously we don't want to focus on today too much, but I would say that what we have observed is there are things that history can explain. First, and I was really interested to read Mannheim's Utopia and Ideology, which is almost a real-time commentary on the far left and the far right in Weimar, Germany. Mannheim noticed that the problem wasn't that people were experiencing economic crisis, rather that the economic crisis had shattered what he called their ideology. And for Mannheim, the ideology is, as a concept, is a passive ideology. It has to be a bit like common sense that explains the world. You don't have to think about it. Everybody acts as if it is right. And he said, the moment ideology breaks, you get utopian thinking. And so he understood that both the KPD and the NSDAP were hoovering up people who'd begun to think in a utopian way. And then he says, once they begin to think in this utopian way, every aspect of reality that doesn't match their utopia has to be rejected. And so that's Mannheim's explanation of how economic crisis creates this kind of mass it's not irrationality, it's rejection of evidence. Because you only have to look at, say, the QAnon phenomenon to see the exact same thing. And you see how the determination to say the world's ruled by oligarchic financial people who are who've destroyed America, and liberalism is killing our country. And then you look for evidence, and then the evidence you graft onto it, as in QAnon, is the absolutely wild theory that that a bunch of liberals are running a child trafficking ring and sucking their blood to gain everlasting life, because that's what QAnon is. You can only understand that as a product of ultimately the economic if you first of all understand that the economic shatters the ideology. And as soon as the ideology is shattered, people start to run for the utopian solutions. So that was the first insight, I think, from drawing from the historical writing. The second insight, I think, would be, I know historians quite rightly there's this debate, isn't there? Why do counterfactual? Why explore what could have happened? What's the point? For me, understanding struggles as a game, not through game theory where everyone is rational and where there is, negative or zero sums, but through conflict theory, where you understand irrationality, where you understand the irreversibility of time, that a mistake made on day one cannot be reversed on day 100, or a phenomenon created on day one cannot be reversed. That led me to try and tell the story of both the rise of Mussolini and the rise of Hitler as preventable facts, preventable events. And so I adopted this metaphor of a board game, a kind of the rise of Mussolini, stopping Mussolini a game in 5 moves. And it allowed me, possibly schematically, one would not probably attempt this as an academic, but it might be something you want to do with students to get them thinking. It's what are the 5 points at which you could have stopped Mussolini? How would it have happened? And what stopped the liberals, the left, the state, the king from doing so? Actually, as someone who already knew quite a bit about the rise of fascism, it allowed me then to focus on those moments in more historical, detail, and gather evidence, the first-hand evidence as clearly as I could for that. So you're looking for detail. And again, there's a moment where Italo Balbo was the henchman of Mussolini. He was the man in charge of the black shirts. And I found, once I'd worked out in my mind the real structure of the social process that brought him to power, then I could place Balbo in that process. So, the first thing is there has to be a fascist party. Well, Balbo wasn't a fascist. He was one of the commandos in the Italian army, an officer. And he writes in his autobiography, I was sitting getting drunk in Ferrara, fighting Bolshevism by drinking martini, when I noticed these guys out on the street parading around in their black shirts. And he approaches them and he says, I'll become your leader if you get me a job in a bank and pay me so many lira a month. And he does. So the origin of the sort of second biggest fascist in Italy is almost that. Then when he's driving to power, on the moment where they're planning the March on Rome, which is move 5 in the game, they went on holiday to a posh resort on the Italian Riviera, and stayed in the same hotel, or went for dinner in the same hotel as the mother of the Queen, and she came over to them and said, "We support what you're doing." Right. So in terms of how to just explaining what I do and why I've done it, that's one of the things that I think was the product of it. I think I did try, out of the study of now and the study of the past, that the two events I focused on. David's asked in the chat, why not talking about Spain? I come to that. I decided to look at the rise of Nazism and the rise of the Italian Fascist Party, because they are fairly pure movement eras, whereas the coming to power of fascism in Spain is more a product of an interaction of an armed wing of the militaristic conservative bourgeoisie and the fascist movement itself. I think it's utterly interesting, but I didn't study it for the book. I've studied the Spanish Civil War itself, but not the rise. Okay, so what I tried to do in the end was just produce a sort of, instead of a static definition of an ideal type, here's fascism, here's what it is, more, what does the process normally look like? And what are the key things that we need to do to stop that process happening? And I've come up with a kind of, where is it? A kind of components of the fascist process. And they are, without reading it out, there's got to be a big disruption that destroys the ideology that's explained the world. 2, there's got to be a big threat for, in Italy's case, it was the Comintern. And those of you who know the Italian situation, the problem was that the moderate leaders of the Italian socialist movement, the maximalists, matched their moderation with outrageously crazy left-wing pronouncements that they were going to join the Comintern and former Soviet Italy. There's always going to be an oppressed group rising, and the study of those few months where the Italian fascists destroyed the Italian socialist peasant movement, Fede Terra, for me are a brilliant case study, because it's like they're sitting in their gentlemen's clubs. The peasants have seized the land. The peasants are dictating contract terms. The peasants are occupying the center of each rural town, dictating rural prices, agricultural prices, and they can just about tolerate that. And then the moment comes where the peasants win, the socialists win every seat in the local council. And suddenly this has been their kind of unofficial gentleman's club. Now it's occupied by people who don't wear shoes at work. And that snapped them, and they literally went, who can help us? The fascists were nowhere in central Italy until that happened. They were all in Milan. And they basically, the Italian landlords of Emilia-Romagna invented fascism as a technique. I found it utterly compelling that the similarity between that and the way right-wing America reacted to Me Too and Black Lives Matter. They're fine with Obama. They're fine with quite big mass struggles like Occupy. But as soon as black people are taking control of policing, and dictating that they cannot be killed by random cops, you see the same process, the switch on of, my God, the world's ending. An oppressed group rising is number 3. Number 4, culture war. The class antagonisms have got to translate into existential, I can't believe you believe that type conversations. There needs to be a single fascist party. Now, I don't know whether we'll need a single fascist party this time to achieve fascist-like governments. I think you would for a fascist regime. And we're lucky at the moment that that's not what they're into. If we want to talk about what they're actually into, we can talk about why they operate in such anti-hierarchical, networked and internationalist ways at the moment. It's to do with what their project is. The middle class have got to panic. That is incredibly constant in the process, that the middle class panic and express their panic through populist plebeian politics. It's what's happening now in America. It's what's happening now in France with the Islamophobia. It's certainly what's happening in when you look at the places where there's been a surge, like Brazil. The middle class panic in Brazil is about the return of Lula. Really important, point 7, the rule of law is eroded. I think that once you're into where the rule of law cannot happen, where you can't stop a fascist demonstration because the police won't, or political murders are not prosecuted. I think that's where we have to say that's where the big opportunity lies. That was the problem for the Italian state throughout the entire rise of Mussolini. The Italian state was ineffective in the rule of law. The German state wasn't. And in fact, the German state, right the way through to Hitler's appointment by Hindenburg, probably did enact the rule of law. But that period between January 1933 and May, June 1933, where Hitler seizes power properly from the remains of the Weimar Republic, that period is characterized by the rapid breakdown of the rule of law. Point 8, progressives are paralyzed. People become so intimidated they can't go on the streets. I actually experienced this during the last decade covering Greece. In 2011, 2012, the anarchists controlled the streets of large parts of Athens. By 2013, 2014, the anarchists were terrified, sitting in their squats, and they said there was whole areas of kind of proletarian Athens that they couldn't go into because a combination of riot police and fascists had controlled them. And we're talking about people with rifles patrolling on roofs, fascists with AKs, unmolested by the cops. And that's a really interesting moment because to see how despairing those people were at that point. Of course, Syriza coming to power saved them a bit. Point 9, right-wing populism fails. I think this is the important thing, that the right-wing populism in the form of Hugenberg in Germany and the Harzburg Front failed. The equivalent for me in Italy is I've forgotten his name's gone out of his shirts now. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the blue shirt movement. The plan was on the eve of the March on Rome, the bourgeoisie said, we'll have a mass rally of the blue shirts and that will kind of let all the steam out. And then we can kind of contain Mussolini inside parliamentary democracy, whereas Mussolini wanted a fascist state, not a fascist government. And they advanced D'Annunzio and it failed. Well, he fell out of a window, which is always the accidents of history always help. We don't know whether he was helped through the window by one of Mussolini's people. But the far right populism has to fail. And point 10, the elite have to actually embrace fascism. And we saw it in Italy and in Germany. So if we think about, I'm more interested in that as a process. Now, Paxton says, I'll stop here. Paxton says there are dangers. There's just as many dangers in writing a generic process as there are in writing generic static definitions. He says, but the thing is, the writing of the process is a dynamic thing and can be done far more easily by gathering evidence and processing evidence, first-hand accounts, than these static definitions are kind of standing in the way of understanding right now. And I'll finish off with this. What do I think modern fascism consists of? I think it consists of a thought architecture that is structuring the thinking both of right-wing populists and of the parts of conservatism. And the number one foundation stone of modern fascism, the great replacement theory, the theory that immigration is a form of genocide against white people. That is the through line of all fascisms. Number 2, that the main enemy is liberalism. When they talk about Marxism and cultural Marxism, they're really saying liberalism has facilitated this. Point 3, cultural Marxism, feminism, black liberation theory, gender politics are destroying the Western world. Point 4, don't do anything about it. Don't do anything rash. Practice metapolitics, practice the ideological struggle, and prepare physically for point 5, which is the moment that the Western world collapses. So this is not an immediate march to power dynamic. It's something that is far more, and to finish here, it's far more attuned to building a far-right movement and a far-right momentum and a process within the kinds of democracies we have and the societies, network societies, globally linked societies. I would say that modern fascism is not palingenic ultranationalism. It is an international movement to prepare for the collapse of the Western democratic model. At the point of that, they will launch what they all fantasize about, which is the global ethnic civil war to create ethnic monostates. And to finish, I'll say, therefore, what I think, when we were fighting the NF and the BNP in the 70s and 80s, we were fighting Nazi tribute bands. We were fighting backward-looking nostalgia groups, which still basically nurtured the ideologies of fascism. Colin Jordan on that BBC TV series was effectively a Hitlerite. What we're dealing with now is fascism regrown from its pre-1914 historical roots, in the sense that you can skip the entire period of Hitler and Mussolini, and you go back to Nietzsche, you go back to Spengler, you go back to Houston Stewart Chamberlain, scientific racism. What I've just said are traceable to that. And you wouldn't even have to read Mein Kampf or Mussolini's theory of doctrine of fascism to come to those conclusions. So I'll finish there. I don't know whether that's been of any use. I've tried to keep it very, sort of historically focused, rather than what's going on now, which of course we're all obsessed with. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul.
God, went on twice as long. Never mind.
No, that was fine. That's why I let you carry on, because it was the thing. I mean, there is obviously a lot more in the book. So, I mean, I do advise people to read it. Some of it is really quite interesting and relatively novel thinking on some of these complex issues. So who wants to contribute first? There's also a couple of comments in the chat, which I'll come back to after we've taken the people who are waving. You can either wave or do the hands up. So Marilyn moves first. Marilyn, you need to unmute, of course.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, for people who don't know my history, just very briefly, my father was an anti-Nazi activist, a member of the KPD, and I discovered various things about his activities, and also relatively recently managed to interview various people before they had died, who had also been activists, KPD activists. And my question or assertion is, although I didn't follow everything you said, Paul, but what seemed to me to be missing in terms of your view of the growth of modern fascism is the importance of the movement on the streets.
Yeah.
And that is what I characterize as what happened in Germany, to a lesser extent in Italy. But that, Nazism, I mean, as you said towards the very beginning, Nazism drew from the same pool of people, and it organized itself initially from the 1919, 1920, and then, of course, increasingly so. So, there was a real attempt to dominate the local community, the streets, the taverns, etc. And I see that as an essential characteristic of what I would call Nazism or fascism.
Yeah.
I want to comment, Paul.
Yeah, I think that's true of when we say streets. I think we should also say public space.
Yes.
So if we think about how the black shirts operated in the Italian in Emilia Romagna, I've done sort of with Google Maps. You can do route maps. So from the HQ on the main street of Ferrara to the first village they attacked is an 8-minute drive. But to the one they attacked 2 weeks later is a 20-minute drive. They would arrive. There was no street in the sense. It's a tiny village. They would arrive, beat up, tar and feather, activists. By the end of it, Balbo describes walking into a meeting of 400 peasants who were meeting for a strike, standing on the stage with a stick, saying nothing because they knew what to expect. And the meeting dispersed. He said, I don't want to even to do what I could do to you because understand. Because understand what could be done. I think if we're looking today, the problem is so much of where they organize is online, and where they nurture the ideology and reinforce each other's prejudice, and sort of this is the other thing, they can do it anonymously because you can impute who is who. You don't even have to say I'm Jim from Walthamstow and I am a fascist. You're basically talking to thousands of online people. And one of the things, Hope Not Hate activists who infiltrate them describe them as like a shoal of fish. What happens is that ideologically, suddenly the leaders basically, or the influencers suddenly decide this is important. And they suddenly decide that trans rights is the thing that's going to recruit more people. So forget Islamophobia, move to trans rights. And they do, or animal rights even, which is a big anti-Jewish and anti-Islam code word. So because they're online, what they do on the streets I think has to be seen almost now like text, subtext. I'm not sure which is which. When they are on the streets, often all they're doing is creating material to share online. Now, eventually, they move to the repressive phase. So if you look at what they've done, for example, in America, they've begun to dox the anti-fascist movement. So everybody who gets arrested on a demo goes on a website called Antifa Watch. Your picture, your mugshot, where you live is there. And then they will physically come outside people's houses. So that's what I think is different in the developed world. I'd say in India, with the RSS and the Hindutva, that is following exactly the Nazi pattern. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of definitions, I'm not so interested in the definition of what is fascism, but how they gain power. I think you're absolutely right, Marilyn, to say that at some point they have to challenge the rule of law. They have to prove that they can kill people, beat people up, and dictate how civil society runs physically. That is absolutely the case. But because so many of them are fixated on day X, on the big day when the world ends, right now, a lot of them think that they don't need to do that. And that actually the difference is as well, neither the Weimar Republic nor the Italian Republic or the Italian Kingdom of Italy in 1921 had a particularly repressive state. I would argue that most bourgeois states today are way more repressive and militarized than either of those states. And so the fascists can rely, for breaking strikes, for breaking left-wing movements, they can always rely on the state in a way that they couldn't in 1920-21.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I've got Richard Kirkwood. Richard.
Do excuse me, I'm eating a cake.
I was just going to follow up that discussion with given that we accept, or at least I think we do, what Marilyn's point, which is, that the terror on the streets was one of the things that disabled anti-fascists, in the sense that they weren't able to get as many people out in their support as they would have done if they hadn't been frightened of being beaten, having the so-and-so beaten out of them by these thugs. The question then is, how does, or is it possible for modern day fascism to have that effect in the rather more indirect ways that you're talking about? Because it seems to me that that battle of the streets would still have to, in some sense, take place for modern day fascism to advance beyond being a rather nasty influence on right-wing populism, which it is at the moment, into being a genuine challenge to our movement, to the workers' movement, and to liberal democratic existence. And I don't quite see from your account how that transition is going to happen, particularly given that people, in most of the capitalist world, there are still significant groups of workers who would be willing to stop it getting to the small stage, which is the first step to taking command of the street.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And if we take the 6th of January, the Capitol Hill insurrection as a case in point, I think what did Trump want on that day? He wanted a constitutional coup. He wanted Mike Pence to annul the election using a plan that he'd drawn up with a bunch of right-wing constitutional lawyers sitting in a hotel opposite where it was happening. And the role of street violence in that constitutional coup was going to be crucial. That's why Trump summoned them. His lieutenants, Roger Stone and others, it may have even been his chief of staff, had clear links to the far right. And this is what we will find out in the trials. The far right thought they'd been summoned there to stage an insurrection. Now, you don't need, well, a historian doesn't need a legal document. But even legally, it is a crime to encourage the disobedience of a law of the United States, especially if you're the president. And so we can see the symbiosis, the two groups that are in the dock, Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers militia. One is a classic right-wing white supremacist militia. Proud Boys very much a product of the postmodern era. It's about masculinity. It has people of color in it. It's mainly about it's focused around misogyny. But they were militarized as well. They took their order in the sense they took their objective, which was to heavy Pence and the senators into annulling the election. They didn't need, because they're a non-hierarchical movement, they didn't in that way need orders. They had, in a way, the thing between orders and suggestions are standard operating practices. And what happened is that they simply adopted, they were all ex-military, a standard operating procedure of how you go into somewhere, and they did it in a militaristic way. They almost didn't need telling, we're going in, but on the chats, the evidence in the deposed in the court cases shows that they did have orders. They were ordered. So I think that, as you say, the civil society we have is much more liberal and much more rule of law based and human rights based than the Weimar Republic or the Italian state in 21. But if we think what the consequence would have been had they succeeded, the consequence would have been, first, Trump is still president and Biden will not be president as of tonight. Right now, there were two bombs planted at the Democratic and Republican HQs. The bomber has still not been found, so it's a very professional job. They didn't go off. What if they'd have gone off? Next, what if Pence had, even wavered, just delayed for a few hours? The police were nowhere, and the police, in other words, conformed to the classic problem. There was no rule of law around that building for several hours. And into that vacuum, Trump was ready to step. Once he had stepped, I think then the question would have been to the American state, are you prepared to kick this guy out by force of arms? And what would have that looked like? That would have looked like a military coup. The military would have gone in and said, sorry, we're arresting you, Mr. Trump. You You've defied the Constitution. I have no doubt whatsoever that at that point, millions of people on the far right, driven by far right ideology, which has prepped them, which has infused their networks for years, would have gone out state by state and would have been in a early stage civil conflict. So I think that's how it works. They're not so worried about keeping the labor movement off the streets, because also the left and labor movement, we don't work physically anymore. We operate through networks. What they're concerned about is to attenuate the rule of law so much that we cannot defend ourselves. The police won't defend us. Lawyers can't get us out of jail. Demonstrations can't happen. Strikes can be broken. I think that's how it's going to happen.
Okay, thanks, Paul. You're going to have another quick bit of tea. Can I take up a couple of questions from the chat, and then I'll come on to David Morgan. But Diane Kirby, I don't know whether you want to ask this question live, Diane, because we can't see you. Otherwise, I'll read it out.
Yeah, read it out, please.
Okay, thanks. Right, I think concept of fascism as an unfolding process very helpful, but would like to hear a bit more of how you arrived at this conclusion.
Well, it's literally because I was frustrated with the legacy of the 1970s to the 90s, the production of all these abstract, ideal type, static definitions. And Robert O. Paxton, in his book about fascism, came up with a stylized process. Now, Paxton's process is only 5 points, and 2 of them involve the power stage. So kind of, I thought there's got to be a more detailed process than just 3. So that's what I just set up to do. And obviously, if I'd have factored in, if you factor in the non-stereotypical ones, like Spain, which is a mixture of a military coup, and the fascist movement itself is a mixture of different far-right nationalisms. Another one would be Austrofascism, where you get Dollfuss trying to graft Catholicism onto fascism in order to stop Nazism, but then because of the Anschluss and Hitler's determination that indeed National Socialism would take over. There's a really interesting. I got translations done of the work of Lucy Varga, who was. I don't like to say this because it's sexist, but she is best known as the girlfriend of the leader of the Annales School of History. But she was a brilliant historian in her own way, and is lost to us because she died under the French occupation and never came to full fruition. But Lucy Varga's work is well known it's seen now as among the founders of the political religion school of fascist studies. And she looked at kind of the way in which National Socialism then supplanted Catholic fascism in the Vorarlberg region of Austria, the Alps. So the thing is, if you dial that in, and if you dial Spain in, you come up with probably a more rich definition. But for me, the point of theory is activism. The point of theory is to inform activism. And I wanted to arm these young activists with something better than what the Comintern left them, which was hyper-economist, very little acknowledgement of the autonomy of the psychological and of the political from economics, and free them from their academic tutors in a way, and let them have the ability to think critically about the world of static definitions, which they're just basically collaging static definitions at the moment. And I think I wanted them to be in a world of interacting with the material and creating their own picture of the game they were in.
I think that's very helpful, Paul, in explaining what you were trying to achieve. Certainly others will no doubt respond on whether the Comintern's theory was deficient, but I tend to sympathise with your analysis. Does John Clemo want to speak? I mean, John, you put a long point in the chat with a question at the end of it. So do you want to ask that? Or shall I read it out? Right, I'll read out then. Always an oppressed group thing. So what's the relationship between the elites in power and the working classes rising against them when the bourgeoisie who have got to panic, unquote, cannot deal with areas decisions enshrined with the democratic rule of law. Where then, what's next?
I mean, I think we have to talk about, if you want to talk historically about that question, let's think about a good example. If you accept my assertion that it was the cultural rise of the Italian peasantry, actually, and not the occupation of the factories in September 1920, it's the winning of the election by the socialist peasantry that flips, because the bourgeoisie here, that is the factory owners, were prepared to do a deal with, if you read Paolo Spriano, Occupation of the Factories, they were trying to do a deal with the workers. They even said at one point, take power, form a social democratic government, for God's sake, stop striking. The reaction of the Italian landlord class to the occupation of the land that's what I mean by an oppressed group rising. People who are never supposed to be in power suddenly have power. Okay, now I think then it's true that the landlords go to the Italian fascists and say, help us, please. And lots of young men sign up and they call themselves fascists. And they have a model, because Mussolini's already established it in Milan, of squadism, of elan. And by the way, this is drawn from the commando groups in the Italian army from the late stage of the First World War. And they already have ideologies in the form of nihilistic futurism, Marinetti and co. So they've all read this. They're all engulfed in the world of the talking, the silent cinema, futurist poetry, the motor car. They were big fans of like mechanism and machines. And so now you've got the movement. What do you do with it? I think then it's at that point, this is where we're not talking about an abstract concept called the bourgeoisie. In general, the Italian liberal bourgeoisie didn't want fascism. It's just that they wanted an end to chaos. And so Balbo sets out on an 18-month campaign to create chaos. And that's what he does. As they went around smashing up the working class movement, I would argue that most of the acts of violence they perpetrated were symbolic. They were brutal, but they were symbolic. I use one in the book. At one point, the police in Ferrara banned the Italian fascists from carrying clubs. And so they went to a socialist cooperative of fishermen, raided it. If you've ever had bacala, which is salted cod, the cod is like a stiff cod about a meter long. And they just walked around the city hitting people with salted cod. And if you think about what that was, think about what the symbolicness of that violence and how it was communicative. And at a certain point, Balbo goes to the bourgeoisie, which is the liberal bourgeoisie who rules Emilia-Romagna. And he says, right, we, the Italian Fascist Union, largely dragooned peasants who don't want to be in it, we now want to control the whole social security fund of this region. And if you don't give it to us, we're going to occupy the city. And they pulled that off. They gave them the money. Then at that point, the Italian factory owners are thinking, well, the working class is defeated. So we maybe don't need these guys. But it's pretty clear to us that our old way of ruling doesn't work anymore. So, and more of our sons and daughters are quite keen on them. So let's give them a chance. Once Mussolini wins power through the March on Rome, I think you still got bourgeois skepticism. It's not like Hitler where they're all bought in. You've got bourgeois skepticism, but at this point, he then begins, and this is the magic of Mussolini, he begins to create a new capitalism. He moves from ultra market capitalism, which was his promise to the liberals. I'll get rid of the welfare state. I'll get rid of business regulation. He moves really quickly before 1929, but especially after, towards corporatism. And it's not therefore a question of you're somebody in the supply chain for Fiat making engine parts and you have this factory. Do you like Mussolini or not? The fact is, he's created a giant industrial thing of which you are part. You have to be part of it to be part of the Italian bourgeoisie. So I think that is my answer to that. Now, we will only get fascist or fascist type governments if, I think, sections of the hyper-nationalist neoliberal ruling elite are so terrified of popular discontent that they look towards them. They realize the state can't contain that discontent. I think actually, weirdly, one of the places, where you might see it fairly soon is Russia. Putin hasn't needed a mass movement for a long time. Now there's a mass movement against him. I'm certain that what he'll be thinking is, who can come to the streets for me, Putin? Who can stop the anti-war movement? I reckon that'll be the next phase of this crisis.
Okay, thanks, Paul. That one's a bit depressing, or possibly. Right, David Morgan, you're next. David.
Hello, David.
You need to unmute.
Yeah, I have done. It does take a bit of time.
Okay, off you go.
Thanks, Paul. I think we're on agreement on a lot of things. We just sort of. I'm wondering about definitions of fascism, and I'm a bit worried that you've not mentioned such theorists as the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
And what their definition of fascism can appear in liberalism, for example. It's about social control. It's about maintaining power. It's about mechanisms like technology. The use of culture, and kinds of discrimination that exist in society. It's about social organization as well. Things like how to maintain power. Mass culture actually controls people, and that's got elements of fascism. I mean, liberalism. You said that the right are opposed to liberalism, but I think what is liberalism? Liberalism's got some things that are not good for ordinary people. It wants to change the market so that there's no workers' rights. I did make a comment in there that the traditional working class tend to be neglected. That was possibly why by traditional labour movement, not the trade unions necessarily, but labour parties, even left parties focusing on immigration and stuff, and traditional working classes are kind of alienated from that, and they don't see the left as offering solutions to them. So the right can come in as a fake left, as the Nazis did in Germany. They had the red flag with a swastika on it, but it was still a red flag. Illiterate workers might not have noticed much difference because they're not politically conscious. So they did follow. The mass workers did follow Hitler for a while, so that could happen. And Trump had a lot of supporters from industrial workers in America because the Democrats had closed a lot of the industries down. So we have to be careful that the traditional working class are not neglected, and we have to understand. I think fascism can exist in liberalism. That's the point I was making.
I wanted to try and narrow down the use of it, and therefore I tend to think with that later 1950s Frankfurt School view, and you can see it as well in the work of Foucault as well, where Foucault says, there's a fascist in every one of us. That's fine, but I would like to try and use it. There's at the other end of the stick, you had Marxist historians like Tim Mason, who wouldn't even admit that there was a comparative study, that you're talking about the Nazi Party, the Italian Fascist Party, and that's it. And they were quite different, and they were 10 years apart as movements. And you're lucky if you can find a few granular similarities to them, and that the historian's job is to study each phenomenon as a thing. So I don't agree with that. I think there is a generic study of fascism to be done, but above all, it's to be done at the movement stage, historically, of far-right movements that want to overthrow bourgeois society and kill a lot of people. And so that's where I kind of tried to limit my focus. As to the relationship between with the working class. I mean, it's interesting. Here we have another problem for Marxists, which is, how do you define the working class? There's the sociological or economic definition, but I'm more of a sort of E.P. Thompson sort of type of person, where Thompson says, classes form themselves through projects. Thompson said, the 18th century British working class didn't look like the 19th century British working class, but it was a working class formed around a project of liberty and political rights. No, even if you don't go the whole hog on that, you could say, is it true that some working class people went to the Nazis? Yes. Is it true that the Nazi Party membership lists, if you take them strictly, if you chop a line through them, look very much like the census of German society? Yes, also. They had just as many workers as Germany had workers proportionally. But if you then say, what was the German working class? And the German working class was 13 million left voters who divided their votes, and trade unionists who divided their votes all the way through the Weimar Republic between the KPD and the SPD and the SAP briefly. Very few of them went over to fascism. In fact, Erich Fromm, in that famous survey he does point out that there were people on the left who had very authoritarian views. This is long before Adorno, after the war, comes up with the idea of the authoritarian rebel personality. Fromm noticed that there were people who I think, to quote from memory, they love the idea of overthrowing capitalism and authority, but have not 1 ounce of attachment to the idea of freedom. But he then said that the point at which such people flipped to the Nazis was only 2. 1929, during the referendum on the Young Plan, which would have subordinated Germany to American imperialism, when only the KPD on the left opposed the Young Plan. At that moment, some people switched over to the Nazis, but Fromm says really it was after the seizure of power. It was after 1933 where you get a significant switch from KPD youth over to the Sturmabteilung, when they realized, and Daniel Goering has great evidence for this in The Brown Plague, where he says they're sitting alongside each other in youth hostels, singing rival songs, and after dark they whisper, we all want the same thing. We all want the overthrow of capitalism. It's just that I think Stalin will do it and you think Hitler will do it. I mean, there is that story for definite, but I think the majority story is that the working class, as self-described, as organized, was remarkably resistant to Nazism. And as we know in Italy, it was completely resistant to fascism. It had to be physically subordinated by a mass middle-class militarized movement. And the problem of the Italian working class, that it was led by a complete bunch of idiots who, in all 3 variants, ultra-left Bordigist communism, maximalist socialism, and then the middle of the road, the actual Turati, the party leader, they all thought that their victory of the proletarian power was inevitable. And they were completely wrong.
Thanks, Paul. Right, Steve Cushion. Steve, you're next.
You 2 things really. You speak about the rule of law, and you almost used it the same as if that was something to do with human rights. Well, surely that depends what the law says.
Yeah.
I mean, we're now at the minute we've got the Police and Courts Bill and the Nationalities Bill, which are pretty horrific. But Dollfuss, you mentioned earlier. I mean, he was legally the Chancellor of Austria, yet he still smashed the Karl Marx off. Pétain was legally given plenary powers by the same parliament that had been elected for the Popular Front. So there's, as I say, that business about depending on what the what the law says. The second thing I'd just like to say is your book title is How to Stop It.
Yeah.
And we're interested. I think it's worth mentioning here 1934 in France, when basically a general strike pushed by almost against the will of the leadership of the Communist Party and the SFIO, pushed by workers from the bottom, stopped, a pretty disorganized fascist coup, but nevertheless did stop it. The liberals of the Radical Party were very much violence there, very Johnny-come-latelys, only kind of got into the game late and long enough to stab Leon Bloom in the back. So I think in some senses I'd like to stress that as because otherwise we can. One of the ways it seems to me that fascism intimidates people. I mean, I grew up given stories of the Holocaust. I was so frightened of these people that I thought they were somehow invincible. It was only when I saw a mate of mine punch one in the mouth up the top of the market and he fell over that I thought, this is they're not as powerful as all that. So but I think it is that how do we stop it is the important question.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously if you stop the clock in 1934 in France, then what happened? The mass strike and the mass demo led to the unity of the socialists and communists and the defiance of the Comintern. It's a great story that the Comintern was saying to them, don't unite, and this guy Jacques Doriot, who became a fascist eventually, but was a communist leader from Saint-Denis, just defied them. Yes, what happens then? I think it's Julian Jackson that is the best writer on this. Yeah. What happens is that you then get a mass cultural anti-fascism from the bottom up. These committees of intellectuals, CV, I can't remember the Committee of Intellectuals Against Fascism, turns out to not be like sort of surrealist painters. It was the teachers in every town, and the fact there was no branch of the Committee of Intellectuals Against Fascism, Vigilance Committee Against Fascism, allowed the SFIO and the PCF's members to all go to the same place every week and organize. And I think it's from that, of course, then that becomes the agreement on the Popular Front between the three parties, step by step. You had to have a change of mind at the Comintern to make it work. There were people all over the Comintern saying it should work. And what did it lead to? It led to a joint governmental program in both France and Spain for a communist, liberal, socialist, social democratic joint electoral slate. And bear in mind, in Spain in February 1936, they only won by, 90,000 votes, between sort of two blocks of 3 million. It was a narrow victory. And political violence began almost immediately after that victory. In France, they won devastatingly well. And again, you already had the mass strike underway by the time they come to power. To me, how to stop fascism, the fascism we have, obviously, a large part of it is about disrupting their networks, about countering disinformation, monitoring the actual outright fascists to make sure we know what they're doing, prosecuting them when they break the law. But I've boiled it down to three things. Enzo Traverso, the Italian writer, is very keen on the idea that anti-fascism emerged in the late 30s as an independent cultural phenomenon, bigger than socialism, communism, and anarchism. It was the cultural product of the reality, and it transcended the narrow political ideologies that existed. So anti-fascism is number one, the emergence of an anti-fascist ethos. Number two is where there's a real danger. So at the moment in Sweden, there's like no real danger of a fascist government, but the fascists are on 20%. So you have to form governments that freeze the fascists out of power. Same in Finland. The reason we've got one of the most progressive governments in the world right now, the Finnish governing coalition, Social Democrats with the Prime Minister, far left in the cabinet running education, Greens running environmental policy, is because they've got this 20% problem of the Finns party. And they've got to maintain pressure on you've got to not allow conservatism to get into a position where it's totally reliant on a far right party. So that's point two. The modern version of the Popular Front, from below with the culture, above where necessary with agreements. And I think what was Biden's victory, other than an agreement between Biden and Bernie Sanders to mobilize the two wings of the Democrats around the same objective. The third thing is the most controversial among the politically active and among liberalism as well, which is the Karl Lowenstein's concept of militant democracy.
Yeah.
As Lowenstein said, you need anti-fascist laws, you need police the police, so drive fascists out of the police, stop cross-border party donations, stop the ownership of arms, demilitarize the fascist groups by banning their militias and their uniforms. And he pointed out that by 1938, in everywhere where in Europe hadn't gone fascist, had kind of imposed these laws. Now, I argue that we need a 2.0 version of that, based on the German basic law, an anti-fascist police force, a policing the police force, explicit bans on fascist parties, which the Germans don't properly impose. But I would argue that the threat is so great, you probably can't do it with the first two, the ethos and the mass movement. You've got to battle for control and force the state to enforce the rule of law. And yes, of course, rule of law is just the bourgeois rule of law. It doesn't equate with human rights. But to me, it's far more important, because by identifying the breakdown of the rule of law as the key moment in the two fascist case studies, Germany and Italy, I've become more and more obsessed with it. As when I stood on Whitehall 2 years ago, being surrounded by fascists chanting at me, "Paul Mason, you're a traitor. We've researched you." The biggest problem was the police wouldn't stop them. We didn't have enough anti-fascists to stop them. But it was, the police. I said to the police, I'm a public figure. Why can't you stop these people shouting into my face threatening words of behavior? And they said, because we haven't been allocated enough resources to deal with this demonstration. We're just lucky they weren't violent in that sense. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but Steve.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm glad you covered that, because I was actually going to ask the question on the whole notion of the militant democracy and Karl Lowenstein's papers from 1937, because they are actually quite an interesting analysis of the various legislation that a number of governments had actually undertaken, and possibly much more widespread than we would realize now. But interestingly, given Czechoslovakia as one of the strongest examples of attempts by the government to actually repress and contain, obviously, the Nazi element, which in that case was the Sudetenland Germans. But of course, Lowenstein's quite optimistic, and of course this is written before, of course, Czechoslovakia was invaded from Germany. Your basic argument, I think, in the conclusion to the book is, as you just set out, that the wider the Popular Front you get in terms of alliances by anti-Nazi parties within a government is actually the strongest resistance. But the difficulty then, of course, is how you ensure that government itself doesn't become authoritarian and actually move towards elements of fascism, within it, which is obviously, a real dilemma. But Lowenstein's work is actually available on the web, so it is well worth reading. Some of the other works Paul referred to aren't necessarily available in translation or readily available. So Richard, you wanted to come back in.
Yes, it was just in reference to two aspects of things that people have been talking about. And one of them, which it was sparked by Paul commenting that Italian fascism promised the bourgeoisie that it wouldn't interfere with free market capitalism, but then did something different, which was the corporate state. On the other hand, it seems to me, when I first started reading up on fascism, which was when I started being an anti-fascist back in the 60s, one of the phrases I came across about fascism was that it was the politics of the extreme centre, because what it offered to the petty bourgeoisie, from whom it drew a lot of its sort of cadre, was precisely what liberalism also offered, which was get rid of the class struggle.
Yeah.
And we will deal with both sides of the class struggle. And it seems to me that that's an important part of the fascist legacy, which is revivable. That notion that you can avoid having to take sides between the bourgeoisie and the working class by having this powerful state come in and create bits of a welfare state, for instance, in Italy, by force rather than the liberal way, which is by consent. And it seems to me that that's something that the old fascist tradition can revive in a situation, particularly in a situation where the workers' movement is not big, powerful enough to offer a full-scale alternative to capital.
Yeah, I think in both cases, Italy and Germany, the fascist moment of power fills a need for the bourgeoisie. That is without doubt. It's wrongly sequenced in many left-wing people's minds in Italy. It's not the fact that the workers seized the factories, they failed to seize the power, and then the bourgeoisie turns to fascism. The fact is that fascism came forward with a utopia for a different Italian fascism, and it created a mass movement among the petty bourgeoisie and the landlords around that idea. And it's amazing to think, given what fascism became, that the original pitch was free market economics, the end of the welfare state. And that would have been also the end. I mean, remember, firms like Fiat and Lancia were incredibly state, not subsidized, but state organized, state backed by the whole Italian liberal tradition was a form of paternalism and big industrial paternalism. And Mussolini's original pitch to the petty bourgeoisie was almost entrepreneurial capitalism. Will come back. And at the moment when he took power, nobody knew there would need to be a Keynesian economy or a kind of post-1929 statized economy. That's what they imagined they were creating. At the moment Hitler comes to power, it's very clear that Hitler simply is there to enact the program of the Harzburg Front, which was, and Alfred Sohn-Rethel in his book, because Sohn-Rethel was a Marxist who got a job as an economist in a right-wing think tank, and he saw it all firsthand. I do believe this as the analysis of how the bourgeoisie came to fascism. It's like this. For the first 2 or 3 years of the Depression, you could get by through sort of, through state intervention. But in the end, it became obvious that as American dollars drained away out of European economy and the banking system collapsed, the only way of giant capital in Germany ever making a profit again was to find new markets, because it had been squeezed out after World War I of all its markets. And the dominant faction was the globalist, equivalent of a globalist faction. Siemens were getting contracts for the Indian railways or for the Argentinian dam building. And the kind of the people who backed the original Harzburg Front and the DNVP party, the right-wing populist party, they said, no, we need an empire. That empire is probably going to have to be, as we originally thought in the 19th century, from Berlin to Baghdad. It's got to be to the east and southeast of Germany. We've got to carve out much more of the world for us to be able to do. And so they had the project of autarky. The problem is, there was a section of the conservative bourgeoisie who didn't want that, so they would never vote for it. The banks would never back it. And there's 13 million people voting for socialist parties, and there's only one successful party that agrees with it increasingly, and it's the Nazi Party. And I think it's that mixture of knowing what the destiny of the imperialism has to be, and then finding which political group can enact it, which sometimes it doesn't lead to Nazism. You know, I think in a way, Trumpism isn't fascism because a section of the American bourgeoisie, so people like Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, the My Pillow guy, you know, all the people who originally backed Trump were casino bosses. They don't need, they don't need fascism for what they want. They need a different American capitalism. So the really dangerous moments are when only a major fascist force or fascist-like political force embodies this felt need in what the ruling elite of the nation wants. And remember, the other complication for us is we've had 50 odd years or 30 odd years of a globalist bourgeoisie, where the large numbers of bourgeois people believe they live in the first class, departure lounge at Heathrow Airport. They kind of metaphorically live beyond nations. And so they are not going to be so swiftly drawn to this. The ones who are drawn to it are the ones who are already ideologically connected to a set of xenophobic people. Anyway, I take all the points you made, Richard, though, as well.
Okay, thanks. Right, we need to draw it to close fairly soon, I think. But are there any questions or comments from anybody who hasn't yet contributed? There's lots of people who haven't got their videos on, but we know you're there. So this is your last chance. Either put your hand up, or if you're on video, wave. No? Okay, there was one other sort of question or comment in the chat, which was about the relationship in America, a contemporary relationship between QAnon and America's Christian right. I mean, you do touch on this a bit in the book, Paul, but do you want to say anything further on that?
Let me look at where it says that. Oh, yeah, look, okay. Until Trump came along, obviously the people who believe in the Christian right, they're not necessarily irrationalists. They can be just evangelical Christians, and to the extent that any Christian is a bit irrational, fine. But here's how I think it worked. Trump was the first person on the American right who could bring two vital sets of people together. People who go to church every Sunday and are white and believe that there will be a resurrection quite soon, and people who get drunk every night and go to porn cinemas. That was Trump's thing. So he gave the secular plebeian right and the secular Christian right a place to be. And those rallies in 2016, the Make America Great rallies, that's who was there. QAnon, as we know, was a follow-on tactic from the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which said that Hillary Clinton was in charge of a child abuse ring. And it's consciously spread. But what is interesting is that people on the right who already have the theory that there's a new world order controlled by George Soros and etc., all that kind of anti-Semitic plebeian right-wing conspiracy, people in the evangelical movement who believe, the second coming of Jesus is imminent, it didn't take much for the kind of drug of QAnon to get into both bloodstreams. And I think it was designed to get into both bloodstreams. Because then what happens with QAnon, unlike almost all previous conspiracy theories, is that QAnon was co-created. It was co-created almost like in a game format by tens of thousands of people who participated in saying, Q has said this, I think it means this. So let's go to this street corner and look at this CCTV camera to see if it really is pointed towards the White House at an angle of 6 degrees. All that kind of weird shit that they were doing. The materialist explanation, I think, is there in Mannheim. It's once bourgeois ideology explodes and no longer explains the world, people co-create their own utopian replacements. And that's where the QAnon is still morphing, it's still moving, it's still circulating. The other thing is observing how it moved from QAnon to anti-vax stuff under COVID. You became aware that this is an objective phenomenon. Nobody's really driving it. It is driven by activists and by people's desire for a utopian mindset. And whatever is out there, whatever is offered, they will take. The danger of it is that, and the FBI pointed this out, in most fascist ideologies, you get prepare now, commit symbolic violence to tell the story, wait for the day when capitalism collapses and we can have the ethnic civil war. QAnon was really dangerous because it said the ethnic civil war starts on the 6th of January. And that's why they started to predict that people would commit violence proactively. What is the most iconic image we have from 6th of January? It's the QAnon mage, the guy in the funny bearskin. He's got 2 years in jail, but I don't think he was there for violence either. He actually just believed that if he went into that building, he would aid the implosion of the world order. And he's probably right, actually. But yeah, so I think there's a lot more to be done. I would love it, for historians to be able to do comparative histories of these movements and the far more static ones, like Nazi Nordic mythology, the Nordic mythology and the anti-Semitism, which were the seed beds coming out of this Van der Vogel movement. There was a kind of hippie movement pre-1914 of people who went walkabout, and they believed all this stuff again because they had the nature politics of Nietzscheism. That is nature is more important than history and society. So I reckon there's a whole thing to be done about that, but again, fortunately for the historians, it's all there. You can actually track QAnon through millions and millions of posts, millions and millions of reactions. I would love to see some data analysis of how it spreads, etc. But I should probably shut up now because I bet everybody's sick of this.
No, I'm sure we're not. And I think your final point there of, contemporary fascism, especially that on social media, goes much more back to Nietzsche than it goes back to Mussolini and Hitler, is actually a very useful point for us to remind ourselves about. And certainly, while not everybody will agree with everything in your book, Paul, certainly it is a very interesting read, and certainly made me think a bit about a different perspective than I've had before. So do get it and read it. Right, just my final point, which is a plug for the Socialist History Society. If you're not a member, please join. For your membership, not only you get told about talks like this, discussions like this, which are mainly on Zoom at the moment, but we're hoping to get back to some face-to-face sessions relatively soon. You also get our academic journal, Socialist History, twice a year, at least 2 occasional publications a year. The next one, which will be out in a few weeks, is something I've edited, which is various extracts of writings by British socialists and commentaries in relation to socialists in the 20th century, but there's other ones in the pipeline as well. And you also get our newsletter. Our next one will be out soon. So do go on the website and join the Socialist History Society. We also want to know more about what socialist historians, both in this country and elsewhere, are writing. Tell us about your publications, what you're researching on. It's a useful network. We can promote what you're doing, and also, you may well get invited by the committee to give a session like this if we think there's a market for it or an interest in it. Okay, so thanks very much, Paul.
Pleasure.
Sorry to drag you away from Downing Street, but no doubt you'll be back there either later today or tomorrow.
Yeah, who knows?
Well, many of us. So thanks to everybody for joining, and thanks especially to Paul.
Right, thank you. Cheers. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Bye.
There's a lot of it I didn't really understand, but I understood enough of it. Get something out of it.
I'll send you an